action that this country would take in its final development. This is a war which is very different from any we ever fought. You've heard the phrase, I'm sure, many times, brother against brother, father against son, entire households divided by this, as well as, obviously, an entire country. So we're going to take a look at some of the immediate causes, some of the long-term effects, and we'll take a look at some of the comparisons between North and South, advantages and disadvantages that each one of them had in going into this war. Now, when you're talking about this war, keep a few things in mind. That winners write the history. So, of course, obviously, we're going to make the assumption that the North wrote the history of the Civil War because they won. Well, in this particular case, not necessarily so. We're going to be talking about something that historians refer to as the lost cause. This was really the co-opting of the Civil War and its events by the South. Much of what comes out of the Civil War after the period known as Reconstruction is very Southern oriented. Many of the books, the films, etc. So it can present a rather skewed vision of the Civil War.
The years leading up to the Civil War were filled with tension between the North and South. Differences in their economies, technology, politics, and society strained their relationship and the unity of the country. But the most pressing issue may have been slavery, especially whether to allow new slaveholding states to enter the Union. Without slave labor, the South could not continue to grow massive amounts of cotton. Southerners feared that the end of slavery would bring about an economic collapse. They felt that only by having an equal number of free and slave states could they protect slavery. The issue came to a head in 1850 when California applied for admission as a state, a free state. The South threatened to secede or withdraw from the nation if the new state was admitted. Congress finally settled the issue with a compromise. California was admitted as a free state, but other areas in the West would be open to slavery if the people wanted. And Congress passed a tough new law that required the return of runaway slaves. Northerners protested this new law, the Fugitive Slave Act. Abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe was outraged by this law. She wrote a powerful novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, to show how unjust slavery was. The novel illustrated one slave's humanity and suffering at the hands of his cruel master. The novel stunned Northerners who had been indifferent to slavery. Southerners were outraged, calling the book unfair propaganda. The debate over slavery in the territories focused next on Kansas and Nebraska. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas proposed a new law in Congress. It allowed the majority of settlers in each territory to decide whether or not they would allow slavery in the area. This was called popular sovereignty. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery people began streaming into Kansas. They set up rival governments and began fighting each other. Kansas gained the nickname Bleeding Kansas from the bloody Civil War. While the fighting went on in Kansas, the Supreme Court issued a controversial decision in a case involving a slave named Dred Scott. The court said that Congress had no power to ban slavery anywhere, not even in the territories. Abolitionist John Brown had a bold plan to strike against slavery. In 1859, he led a band of followers to seize guns in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown's plan was to lead slaves into a revolt. But the plan failed. Brown was captured, convicted of treason, and hanged. The debate over slavery had led to the forming of a new political party, the Republican Party. It vowed to block the spread of slavery to the territories. In 1860, Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Southerners worried that Lincoln would move to end slavery in the South. Soon after Lincoln's election, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and 6 other states followed. They took over government-controlled post offices and forts. Jefferson Davis was elected as the president of the new nation these states formed, the Confederate States of America. But Lincoln refused to give up a fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, Fort Sumter. On April 12, 1861, Confederate gunners in Charleston opened fire on the fort. After being shelled for 34 hours, the troops inside the fort surrendered. With the shelling of Fort Sumter, the Civil War had begun.
So, film does an excellent job in reviewing many of the things that we talked about which led up to the Civil War, so let's just summarize. Causes of the Civil War. One, and it has to be the top of every list, is slavery. Slavery is definitely the major cause of the Civil War. That has been debated, however, for a long, long time, even during the Civil War, but obviously for a long time afterwards. The constitutional right of secession or no. Obviously, the North, and particularly Lincoln, held the Constitution in high regard, and they were interpreting the Constitution as saying the Union is forever. If it was allowed, secession, then any state not happy with something that's going on could leave. So did they have the right to do this? Political power. The South was losing its grip on the government. We've talked about before the initial Virginia dynasty, keeping in mind that many of the first presidents were slaveholders. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, slaveholders. Many members of the Supreme Court, slaveholders. Much of Congress, slaveholders. So as the North started to gain in population and in the number of states that prohibited slavery, that political power, and that of course is the ability to protect their peculiar institution, started to fade away. On both sides of the issue, fanatics started to take over. Whether it was a John Brown or a Jefferson Davis, these individuals did not see compromise in any way, shape, form, or fashion. They had developed North and South into 2 totally different civilizations. Economically, no comparison. The market economy growing in the North and the West, the growth of industries, the growth of cities, that was not the South. The South, of course, dominated by King Cotton and therefore dominated by slavery. So these are the major causes of the war. The immediate cause, however, obviously was going to be Lincoln becoming the 16th president. He was sworn in March of 1861. And by that time, a number of states had already left the Union. And the sitting president at that time, James Buchanan, did nothing about it. There you see a picture of the actual inauguration.
Then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a Northerner, was elected President of the United States. He believed in a strong central government making laws for the states, and he wanted to stop the spread of slavery. At this point, the southern states began to secede, or leave the Union. South Carolina was the first state to leave the Union in December of 1860. Over the next 6 weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas left the Union. They formed their own country, called the Confederate States of America, and elected Jefferson Davis as the President of the Confederacy. The North said that secession was unconstitutional, and they were ready to use military force to keep the South in the Union. The South claimed it was no longer ruled by the North and would not reconsider. A civil war is one in which people from the same country fight against each other.
Now, with those states leaving, again, Lincoln has not yet been sworn in as president. Uh, it created some initial problems, as you can imagine. And notice, if you take a look at the map, the uh, North, or I should say, the upper South, was still not quite sure what to do. And by no means, any way, shape, form, or fashion, did all of the people in the states that immediately seceded, were they in favor of it. And then the states that left in the future, Arkansas, Tennessee, uh, Virginia, there were large areas that considered themselves unionists, people who wished to stay in the Union. Didn't mean they didn't support slavery, it's just that they supported the Union. As you can see, Lincoln is caught between a rock and a hard place. He is not yet president, but he is being presented with a fait accompli, meaning by the time he gets in, he may not have much of a country to be president of. As you see there in that quote that he says, it might be necessary to put the foot down firmly. He was devoted to peace, but he was more devoted to maintaining the Union. So, April 12th, 1861. The opening salvos of the Civil War are fired in Charleston, South Carolina harbor at a federal fort, Fort Sumter. If any of you have ever been down there, you know that Fort Sumter is built on a man-made island at the mouth of the bay that leads into Charleston Harbor. This was a rather difficult situation to finagle because the Confederacy argued that this was now their fort. Lincoln, of course, did not recognize the Confederacy, nor would he during the entire war. And there's various legalese that forces that. Lincoln, if he reinforces the fort, he takes military action. And that means we started the war, we, of course, being the North. If, on the other hand, he does absolutely nothing, then he looks like he's giving in to the South. So he finally manages to straddle that fence, and he sends a letter to the governor of South Carolina, not to Jefferson Davis. And he says that he was sending a relief force, but this relief force consisted of no military aid. It was simply going to be medical supplies and food. Well, the South realized that they couldn't have this anymore. So they ordered their commanding officer, a gentleman by the name of P.T. Beauregard, to take the fort. Commanding the fort will be P.T. Beauregard's former artillery instructor at West Point, a man by the name of Major Anderson. Anderson refuses to surrender. The opening shots are fired, April 12th, 1861. And of course, this infuriates the North. Lincoln had maneuvered the South into starting the Civil War.
The Civil War began in April of 1861 when the Confederacy demanded that Union soldiers leave Fort Sumter in South Carolina. When the Union soldiers refused to leave, the Confederates fired their cannons at the fort. After the Confederate forces captured Fort Sumter on April 14th, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee seceded. For some Americans, it was difficult to decide which side to choose. Even the border states between the North and South had a hard time deciding which side to support. President Lincoln asked Robert E. Lee to lead the Union Army. Lee, being a Virginian, decided to join the Confederate Army instead. General Stonewall Jackson helped lead the Confederate troops. He became Lee's top general when Lee became the Army commander in June of 1862. General George McClellan was the first to lead the Union forces. He led the Union forces in the Battle of Bull Run near the town of Manassas Junction, Virginia. It was the first battle of the Civil War, and the Union lost. Because McClellan proved to be a poor commander in several battles, Lincoln decided to replace him. Eventually,
Now, that's not true. McClellan was nowhere near that battle. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. The man you see pictured on the screen, Edmund Ruffin. Ruffin was 61 years old, looked like he should be the lead singer in a hard rock band. But anyway, Edmund Ruffin was what's known as a fire eater, hated the North, absolutely hated them. And legend has it that he begged P.T. Beauregard that he be allowed to fire the first cannon shell at Fort Sumter. Ruffin, at the end of the war, was so distraught by the South's loss that he committed suicide rather than face domination by them damn Yankees. Over 3,000 shells would hit Fort Sumter, killing no one. Doing obviously damage, but killing no one. Only one Northern soldier would die at Fort Sumter, and that's because when they fired a cannon shell honoring the flag that was coming down, the United States flag, it exploded and killed one of the attendants. And there you see what Ruffin had to say before he pulled the trigger. My last writing and utterance, I here repeat and would willingly proclaim my unmitigated hatred to Yankee rule, perfidious, malignant, and vile Yankee race. So, the war has begun. What are the advantages, North versus South? For the North, well, number one, population. The North has 4 million men of combat age. Slightly over half of them are going to fight. North has 90% of all industry. So for the most part, they can make and manufacture to fill their own needs. And it's also going to spur on further economic growth. Over 70% of all railroads are in the North. As a matter of fact, when the war starts, the North has more railroad mileage than the entire world combined, let alone the South. So they can move men and supplies quickly from one spot to another. 75% of all money, and in this case, we're talking gold, is in the North. So again, it gives faith to the Northern economy and allows it to expand. Now, when I say allows it to expand, you're going to see the introduction of paper money that they called greenbacks. Of course, today, that's what we see all the time, the dollar bill. But this is going to be issued by the government in lieu of handing out gold, and it is automatically accepted because the North's government is seen as strong and stable. So, railroad mileage, industrial workers that can fill, particularly because of the amount of immigration that is coming, all right? Population, 71% of the total population, and manufacturing. And this is the biggest advantage. Lincoln, as a leader, the job of any president in wartime takes on a number of different aspects, but perhaps the most important is the ability of the commander-in-chief to sell the war, to get the country behind the war effort and to support it. Lincoln was able to do it. He spoke in a language that was the language of the common man. When he, for example, fired McClellan, he made the statement that giving McClellan more troops is like trying to give somebody the ability to shoo flies across the barnyard. They just never seemed to get there. Well, since most of the people in the North were either industrial workers or agricultural, they understood the analogy that he was drawing. Lincoln puts together a superstar cabinet. Uh, his Secretary of State, a man, by the way, who in the beginning was stabbing Lincoln in the back. He was telling people that he was really in charge, and that's the Secretary of State, Seward. Seward had wanted to be the nominee of the Republican Party. Lincoln beat him out, but Lincoln brings him into the cabinet anyway. By the time Lincoln dies, he has no closer friend than Seward. There are other people that are going to be brought into the cabinet. The Secretary of War eventually is going to be Edwin Stanton, who had been a rival attorney of Lincoln's. Lincoln was an attorney for the railroads during much of his time as in private practice. So that's just some of the many individuals that comprised an outstanding cabinet, and all behind a man who, again, knew how to sell the war. Now, the South, population of 9 million as opposed to 20 million. 1 million of combat age, but 80% of them will join as opposed to 50% of the North, and they have 4.5 million slaves who will provide the labor to run the farms, run the plantations, even work in the factories, and even built fortifications. So slavery, in a certain respect, was a huge advantage. They were fighting a defensive war, so they knew the home field, and it always takes more people to invade than it does to defend. However, it's also a disadvantage because they have such a large area and they were bound and determined to defend every inch of it. They had outstanding military leaders, Lees, the Jacksons, the other individuals that followed them. All of these men, most of them West Point graduates, many of them experience from the Mexican-American War, are going to bring all those advantages to their military organization. Most of their men come from an agricultural background. They're used to riding, they're used to living outdoors, they're used to hunting, they're used to firearms. That's not necessarily the case in the North. Now, their leader, this man, Jefferson Davis, from the state of Mississippi. Now, when you look at it on paper, he has it all over Lincoln. He's a West Point graduate, was bemedaled during the Mexican-American War. He was the Secretary of War under Buchanan. He was a United States Senator. He's got all this background. Lincoln's sole political experience was, of course, he was a one-term congressman from Illinois. So on its face, Davis has an extreme amount of advantages. However, he is not able to sell the war. He is not a charismatic figure. The Constitution, which they have, modeled to a great deal after the United States Constitution. However, because of the side they're on, they represent states' rights. And oftentimes, when Davis asks, the states say no. And this is going to be a problem throughout the Civil War. But they have this man.
At my signal, unleash hell.
He, like George Washington during the Revolution, Robert E. Lee will become the face of the South and the Confederacy. He was in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia. He was not, until the end, in charge of all Confederate armies. Lee starts out as an advisor to Jefferson Davis. However, when the general in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia is shot and wounded by a Union marksman, Lee takes over and winds up weaving a brilliant career. Virginia, in the beginning, is not decided on which way to go. However, after Fort Sumter and Lincoln raising armies that are going to have to march through Virginia to put down the rebellion, as you can see, they go with the Confederacy. Virginia has the largest population and all the industry that the South needs. So they move the capital from Mississippi to Virginia, specifically to Richmond. And now you have the two capitals of the opposing sides within 90 miles of one another. And the corridor between those two will have some of the most famous battles of the Civil War. But one of the determining factors is the border states. Those states that you see there in yellow, Missouri, Kentucky, the new state of West Virginia, that's the northern part of Virginia that left Virginia because they opposed slavery, Maryland and Delaware, all of those states slaveholding. And they were on the fence. And this was Lincoln's key. He realized that if he lost those states, if he didn't tiptoe around them, they were going to lose the war. So much of what Lincoln does early on in the Civil War is from a position of having to keep those states firmly in the Union. Kentucky, to him, is the state that is the key. And the reason being, if you take a look at the map, all of the highways, AKA rivers, that run right through Kentucky, they can either be highways into the South or they could be the other way around. And so Lincoln was desperate to keep Kentucky in. Kentucky and Maryland are two states that he's going to have to do a couple of things that some people may say violate the Constitution, but be that as it may, he justified what he did in terms of arresting people, in terms of not allowing their state legislatures to meet, in terms of elections, etc. He justified all that as his powers as commander-in-chief. Now that war has erupted, we need a plan. And the plan will be known as the Anaconda Plan. It is the brainchild of the original general in charge of Northern armies, General Winfield Scott. Scott, of course, one of the heroes of the Mexican and American War. Scott had run for the presidency and lost. Scott, old, infirm, so large that he needed a lift to get up onto his horse. Scott comes up with the Anaconda Plan. The Anaconda Plan, as the snake will justify, the Anaconda Plan was their plan to shut off all Southern trade and ruin their economy. We would follow that plan with some notable exceptions for the duration of the war. However, there were many people that did not support it because Scott was a Virginian, and they felt that he was trying to spare the South the agony of invasion. And perhaps to a certain point that's true, because he felt that eventually they're going to become part of the Union again, and do we want them decimated? And that would be a question that would plague the administration during the entire Civil War. Now, what did the plan involve? Well, one, a blockade around the entire South. Nothing in, nothing out. Now, keep in mind that just the Florida coastline alone was almost 1,000 miles. But all the other coasts that had to be done, it's almost an impossible job. And obviously, you're going to need a rather large Navy, which in the very beginning, we did not have. And the South, very successful in running the blockade early on. However, about halfway through the war, that would change as we increased the number of ships and took over a number of the harbors that the South used to house their blockade runners. The other part of the Anaconda Plan was taking control of the Mississippi River and thereby cutting the South almost in half. So those were the two parts of the plan. A third part would be added, and that would be the capture of the capital. On to Richmond was the battle cry that appeared on many a headline in northern newspapers. Was it necessary? No. And Lincoln knew it. After 1862, Lincoln felt that their chief objective should be the capture of Lee and Lee's army, not the capital. This now begins with the attack on Fort Sumter, what's called Lincoln's 6-week dictatorship. Congress was not in session, and he could have called them back under emergency provisions. However, he chose not to, because now he could do this, what you see on the screen, without any interference by Congress or disagreement. So he suspends habeas corpus, which means they're going to arrest people, not having to give them reasons and not having to have them appear in court. Open all U.S. mail to get rid of treasonous material and to intercept information that may be going back to the South. He automatically expands the Army. He asks for 75,000 volunteers, and he's going to get almost triple that. And he declares martial law in Maryland, in Missouri, and a couple of other states in order, again, to keep them in the northern column. Eventually, when Congress comes back, they will approve of some of these. Others will be contested all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. Now, what are the Confederates going to do? Well, they're going to try to drag this war out as long as possible. This is the old George Washington theory from the American Revolution. They figure they can get the Union tired for them to just pick up and go home. King Cotton is going to become a major player in all of this. It's the basis not only of the South's economy, but King Cotton is also the basis of Europe's economy. So they are going to play the cotton card, as they call it. And what they're going to do is refuse, the South this is, to send cotton to England and France, claiming that the embargo placed around them, the blockade, was prohibiting them from sending it, when in fact that was not the case early on. However, what they were hoping to do by not sending cotton through was to kind of force England and France to recognize the Confederacy and come to their aid in order to keep the industries in England and France going on. Fortunately for England, they had anticipated this problem and they had stocked up on cotton prior to. So the plan does little to help the Confederate cause. Now, what the cotton did not do for the South was something called the Trent Affair. The USS Trent, a blockade ship, stopped a British vessel carrying mail. And on that were two Confederate ambassadors being sent to England, James Slidell and John Mason. Those two were taken off the boat and taken prisoner. England goes fanatical, stopping a British ship, taking passengers off the ship. Now, of course, that's exactly what they did to us prior to the War of 1812, but now the shoe's on the other foot. When Lincoln finds this out, he goes ballistic. While the newspapers applaud the action, Lincoln realizes that this might just be enough to tip England over to the side of the South. So consequently, he orders these two returned and taken to England. And behind the scenes, some diplomatic finagling is done to keep England out of the war. But England's sympathies are largely with the North. And as military action begins, we'll see how those sympathies affect what is about to take place. So that's the end of part one. We'll take a look at part two in our next lecture.